Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode is about Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Lee led his country from 1959 until 1990, before embarking on a long but active retirement as an elder statesman. Though Lee's tenure in office is sometimes described as one of the longest in democratic history, the extent to which Lee allowed free and fair elections is heavily disputed. Indeed, the picture of Lee that emerges over the course of the conversation you're about to hear is not one of a benevolent father of the nation, but of a calculating control freak whose only organising principle is what was good for him. Whilst this could be a description of many of the people examined on this podcast, Lee's flagrant disregard for democracy and personal liberty over the course of more than 3 decades means his story has more bizarre twists and turns than most. Lee's story has everything: jailing of political opponents, dodgy referendums, anti-communism, and even flirtation with eugenics in the 1980s. My guest for this conversation is Singaporean historian PJ Thum. PJ is the founder of New Narrative, an organisation established with the intention of improving democracy in Southeast Asia. It's a fantastic organisation, and I recommend all of you to check it out. We discuss Lee's battle to take over Singapore, the legacy of the British Empire on Singaporean politics, and whether Singapore is really the democracy and the economic success story some claim it to be. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Lee Kuan Yew. Hi, PJ. It's good to see you. How are you?
Hi, Tom. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. It's still the morning with me. Our figure of study today is Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father and first Prime Minister of Singapore. He's, to my mind at least, kind of the ultimate figure of continuity and longevity within politics. He was Prime Minister for 31 years, between 59 and 1990. And he had a very long and active retirement until he died a few years ago. He was born in 1923. Singapore at that time was still under British colonial rule, of course. Can you give a brief overview of the role that Singapore played in the British Empire at the time of Lee's birth?
Well, Singapore was a hugely important port from pretty much the middle of the 19th century. Singapore was founded to service the China trade. As your listeners probably aware, there was a very active trade in tea with China, and Britain was losing a lot of silver, flooding out of the country and into China, and they needed a product which they could sell to the Chinese, and that product was opium. And so Singapore was a transshipment point and a port through which all these products could be shipped to China and from China. And the other main product that came out of China, apart from tea, was actually what today we'd call slaves or indentured servants, coolies, who were shipped out of China into Southeast Asia, and Singapore was the main distribution point for Chinese workers throughout the region. So, as I like to point out, Singapore was very much founded and became prosperous on 2 products, drugs and slaves, and arguably that really hasn't changed today. And that's why Singapore was so important. It rapidly grew because of its sheltered port and location, especially next to the Malacca Straits, into the most important port in the region, and for the British, as they said, the most important port east of Suez. So Singapore was very much not just the linchpin of an economic strategy, but a political and a military strategy for the British Empire throughout the region, and hugely important to all its activities in the region.
And what about Lee's family and his childhood? You've painted a picture of a city, of a port that is deeply entrenched and integrated within the free trade of the British Empire. What role did Lee's family play in this city? Was he born into a wealthy, well-connected, powerful family, or was he born into the large sort of underclass of people there that were relatively poor.
Yes. Okay. So you have put your finger on the main division in Singapore, which is the massive, massive inequality that existed. You had a European and Asian elite who lived perhaps the most luxurious lives that you could find anywhere in the world. And they were supported by hundreds of thousands of other Asians, natives, locals, who lived in absolute poverty and were very much, as I mentioned earlier, indentured servants, slaves, struggled very much for a living. And, by the 50s, you'd see like 30, 40 people per house. That's how crowded downtown Singapore became. But in the 20s, in between the wars, right, what you're seeing is a Singapore that is transforming rapidly, because of all the modern technologies, because of things like refrigeration, advances in shipping, and the local Asian capitalist class is benefiting tremendously from this, and Lee's grandparents were among these people. So when Lee was born, he actually grew up very, very wealthy. And he grew up the child of great, great privilege. The problem was the Depression, and that deeply impacted a lot of local traders and merchants. Many fortunes were lost, and Lee's family was affected. They weren't poor, but definitely he lost a lot of the privilege that he had experienced in his first 5 years. But he became very determined to get that privilege back, and he worked really hard, topped all the schools, including Raffles Institution, which was the local elite school for local children, and won various scholarships to go off to the UK. But of course, that was interrupted first by the war. But in the meantime, he was very much seen by the British establishment as a very bright, talented young man who had a very big future ahead of him, and cultivated very much as a potential local collaborator. Because the other thing to remember about him was he spoke English and Malay. He was what you call King's Chinese, or later Queen's Chinese, or as we call him, Peranakan, in that he grew up very much in this English language environment and had and came from this tradition, not so much of the Chinese who were imported as coolies, but Chinese merchants who came and intermarried with the natives and became very rich. So he didn't speak Chinese. He was very, very fluent in English, and he also spoke marketplace Malay, but didn't speak any Chinese. And this would be a handicap that he would later very much regret and work very hard to overcome in his political career. But it also means he comes from a very narrow class of people in Singapore who were very much who saw themselves as the elites, the local elites, who had a very deep sense of their own position at the top of the local hierarchy, and who very much saw themselves as the natural heirs of the British once the British were going to leave. I also like to tell this other story about Lee when he was growing up, and this was when he was 10 years old. And his uncle had a beautiful singing bird. I think it was a parakeet or something. And Lee looked at it. He came to his uncle's. He saw it. He loved it. He said, "Give it to me." And his uncle said, "No, you don't know how to look after birds. You're very young. You can come here anytime and play with it." And his uncle later left the room. And when he came back, the bird was dead. And Lee had killed the bird. And his uncle asked him, "Why did you do this?" And Lee said, "If I can't have it, no one will." And this attitude, right, that you think maybe he's just 10 years old, actually helps us understand Lee's point of view, because he was so thoroughly steeped in this idea that he had a right, not just a right, but that nothing would be perfect unless he was in control of it, right? And that explains a lot of his control in Singapore and his later, as you said, longevity, in that he, too deep into his bones, he believed that he was the best person to lead Singapore, the best person to guide Singaporeans, and any departure from what he wanted to do was objectively worse. And so I think this incident is really revealing of his whole mental landscape and how he saw his place in the world and how he saw the world as belonging to him.
I think it is quite a good predictor of a lot of the other things that we're going to come and talk about today. You mentioned that Lee went to Raffles in Singapore and that he then applied to scholarships in the UK. He eventually went to Cambridge University just after the war had finished. How did being in the UK, the colonial power still in Singapore at that time, shape his views on the future of Singapore, whether Singapore should be independent? Was his time in Britain the cause of his belief in independence? Did it reaffirm views that he already held before he went there? Or did it perhaps challenge his views about independence for Singapore?
Okay, so before we get to the UK, I think it's important to remember the Japanese occupation.
Sure, please. Yeah.
And the huge loss of British prestige that resulted. I think very few people question the hierarchy of having the British at the top before the war, although there was a massive blow to it because of the Depression and because of the subsequent policies of the British to try and revive the economy. But really, it was the loss to the Japanese, the loss to other Asians that really started the end for the British Empire in Southeast Asia and really reduced the British in people's minds from demigods to just foreigners, right? So Lee, going to the UK, I think his goal is to learn from the British. His goal is to train himself up so that he can assume what I'm sure he saw as his rightful place at the top of the future hierarchy, right? And after the war, it was inevitable that the British would leave. The only question was timing. And I think no one imagined that it would happen anytime soon, but everyone agreed it would happen eventually. And the British themselves wanted to develop a local elite. So Lee saw himself as central to those plans. Now, in the UK, I think there are two main themes that shape his thinking. The first is his interaction with other students, other members of the Malayan elite. Now, when I say Malayan, I mean the historic British Malaya, which includes West Malaysia or Peninsular Malaysia and Singapore, right? Not including Sabah and Sarawak, the Bornean states, which in this period very much saw itself as a cultural, social, historical unity, right? As one broad people who had been united under the common experience of British rule, but also shared a Malay culture. And so in London and then in Cambridge, he interacted with a lot of the future leaders of Malayan independence. And they shared a lot of ideas about, fundamentally, ideas about self-determination and the importance of people governing themselves. And also this idea that they were the natural rulers of Malaya because they formed the current elite. And they had the education and the resources and the ability to take Malaya into independence. But the other thing I think that he was very much exposed to was this very modern idea of socialism. Lee, to his dying day, was very much at his core a socialist. Even if he later applied a lot of very neoliberal ideas from the 80s and also had his whole eugenicist turn in the 80s, which we'll get to. But he was very much a socialist in the sense that he believed that you could create structures that helped human society improve upon itself and change itself and overcome our baser desires as human beings, our baser nature, through sophisticated modern structures, right? I think, in this day and age, it's hard to remember this, but we had this period in our history, post-war, right, where we had nuclear weapons and nuclear power, where we had antibiotics and we had the socialist state, and the possibility of us as humanity transforming ourselves through logical, rational thinking, right, seemed tantalizingly possible, that we could actually transform our societies and overcome narrow nationalism, overcome racism, overcome classism and all these other various forms of discrimination and build better societies purely through rational intellect. And Lee really absorbed that and believed that, and he might be characterized as a Fabian socialist in the sense that he did believe in change, but also gradual change. And I think he also reconciled that with his own position in the elite by assuming that his class would be the one that would institute and lead this change and would naturally, in a newly created socialist, Malayan socialist society, be the ones at the top. So you can see here a lot of the themes of his life already emerging, right? Malaya must be independent. We must govern ourselves. But who is we? We are the elite. We are the number one, the people at the top. And we are going to transform Malayan society to get rid of colonialism, to get rid of racism, communalism, and build a new, better society. And I am going to lead that, right? So I think these ideas are really what he starts developing in the UK, which at that time, of course, was also transforming itself under the Labour government. You have the NHS, Attlee, and the things that seem possible in how we transform our societies and build better ones, the capacity that we believed that humanity could have for rational transformation seemed limitless, and so he's very much from that tradition.
And when he returned to Singapore, how did he begin to put these ideas into practice?
So when he came back to Singapore, there's two things, right? One is that he became a lawyer. One of the natural occupations of anti-colonial leaders, the other being doctors, right? And I guess a third being teachers. But these are the educated elite of a colonial society and people who know how to navigate the rules of the colonial government. So as a lawyer, what he does is he takes on these cases for the people, right? He seeks to connect to the broader working class of Singapore because he realizes that's where political power is going to come from. He takes on cases for labor unions and quite famously for the Postmen's Union, which was his first major victory, and through them try and connect to organizations which represent the people. But what he's also doing is trying to connect to the Communist Party, because at this point in time, the Communist Party is still believed to be this powerful force in Singapore, right? Looking back at as a historian, you realize they weren't. They were basically destroyed by 1950, 1951 in Singapore, at least, while the emergency was still going on in the rest of Malaysia. But in Singapore, because of the urban nature and the tight control that the British had and the key strategic need to control Singapore, the Communist Party were powerless, were pretty much irrelevant by 51. But Lee doesn't know that. And he's reaching out to this communist underground. So he's reaching out to all these different groups which represent change. Labor unions, student groups. And here when I say student groups, it's important to remember that when we talk about Chinese students, many of them are in their early to mid-20s. Because of the war, they go back to school. And because of poverty, it was very standard for students to leave school for a year, work, and then when your family finances are more secure to go back to school. So these are people in the early to mid-20s who are also in school, right? And seeing that the colonial economy and how it's failing them and the massive discrimination against Chinese language, Chinese culture, against Chinese education. So he connects with these groups and represents them. And through that, right, slowly builds himself a base. Now, he also tries to go into electoral politics in the sense of working with the pro-British English-speaking parties, which represent the traditional English-speaking elite. But he rapidly becomes very disillusioned with them, and, no surprise there. And so eventually gets together with other socialists, left-wingers, trade unionists, student leaders to form the People's Action Party in 1954.
And How did Malayan independence and the emergence of that greater Malayan people as an independent polity eventually come about in the 1950s?
So are you referring to merger in Malaysia?
Well, this is where things become a little difficult for me to understand, kind of as an outsider, because I know that obviously eventually Singapore became an independent country, but the way that I've read about it and the way that or what you've alluded to suggests that at least at the beginning, Lee wanted for Singapore to be part of a larger Malayan state. Is that right?
Oh, everyone did. The expectation was that because there was no conception of Singapore as a separate state.
Right. Okay.
Singapore was part of Malaya the way Johor was part of Malaya, the way Penang was part of Malaya, right? The separation at the causeway between Singapore and the rest of Malaya was seen as a colonial act. And it was seen in the context of what the British colonial forces were doing throughout the world in the 40s, where they would take troublesome spots and split them away from less troublesome spots to try and create enclaves, you might say, or areas in which minority majority areas. So partition was something that the British Empire did a lot in the 40s, right? Whether it was Palestine or India or Malaya, in order to try and create viable independent states, to set up those states with the idea that you'd have majorities, clear majorities in each one, so that those states would represent those majorities. Mm-hmm. So for Singapore, we saw that back then as a very artificial divide, right? Most Singaporeans had families north of the causeway, right? Like myself, my father was born in Ipoh, in Perak, right? So I had family up there, and I've always had Malaysian relatives. So for us to have Singapore divided was artificial. And so you could not be a politician in Singapore and be taken seriously and win the support of the public unless you were also pro-reunification. And so that's why from the very beginning, this was a policy that he pursued. The problem was that the government in Kuala Lumpur didn't want Singapore back for the same reason why Singapore had been partitioned from the rest of Malaya to begin with, which is that Singapore was full of Chinese. And the Chinese aren't going to vote for the Malay politicians in Kuala Lumpur. If you take Singapore back then and added it to the rest of Malaya, right, it was roughly 43% Malay, 43% Chinese, and the rest majority Indian. And there was actually a slightly more Chinese than Malay, and that would have undermined the Malay aristocratic politicians' argument that they were the natural leaders and undermined their ability to win elections, right? So this is the quandary that Lee Kuan Yew and other politicians found themselves in that they represented an electorate which wanted reunification, but the other side did not want reunification, and so they had to simply muddle along and say, we are in favor of reunification, in the knowledge that they could not make any progress on it for many, many years until we get to 1960-61, which I think we'll get to later.
So I think Lee became the first Prime Minister of Singapore in 1959. Just to kind of lay out the chronology of this a little bit better, the status of Singapore, or at least the polity that Lee was governing in 1959, was it still part of the British Empire? Was it part of Malaya, or was it technically its own country at that point?
Okay, so what happened was that the rest of Malaya, right, at that point called the Federation of Malaya, won independence from the British Empire in 1957, but Singapore remained a crown colony, and we had a British governor. Singapore was not given independence, but full internal self-government, and part of the reason why it was able to win that was because Lee Kuan Yew colluded with his big rival Lim Yew Hock at the time, who was the chief minister between 56 and 59, and with the British to have his rivals in his own party arrested and detained without trial, right? So from the very beginning of the creation of the People's Action Party in 54, Lee was already plotting to use these people who had popular support, trade unionists, right, labor leaders, student leaders, to win power. But he also knew that at some point in time, he would have to stab them in the back. And in order to remain popular and win elections, he had to get the British to take the blame for it. And that's what he successfully did in the 50s, in 56, 57, right? By managing to get the current Chief Minister, Lim Yew Hock, to really take the blame and be seen as a colonial stooge. And so he then, found himself, because of all his plotting and planning, the head of the most popular party in Singapore, but all the people who had actually won that popularity were now in jail. So all those people who won popularity for the PAP are now in jail. He can freely draw upon it to win power, and he does so and wins the 1959 election. But of course, what happens with 59 is that he can't take office without releasing his rivals within the party, and that's where things really start going wrong for him, because the moment they come out, they want to take Singapore in a very different direction from his very pro-British direction, right? And they want to devolve power to the people and create a more democratic Singapore. Whereas Lee, his point of view, his mindset is basically that, the colonial setup is fine because I rose to the top, right? Never mind, of course, he's a child of privilege, blah, blah, blah. But to his mind, the colonial setup is fine. The only change that needs to be made is that us locals replace the British at the top. Otherwise, this whole hierarchy, it's great. I don't need to concede power. But of course, the labor unions, the student leaders, the people who genuinely represented the people wanted to create a state in which you had democracy and self-determination and human rights. And so before too long, he had to again have a reckoning and get them arrested and detained again. And the pathway to that was reunification, right? Because that was the one thing he could control and turn against them. So he goes to the Tunku and he says that these people are communists, and if you don't take Singapore in, then you're going to have a little Cuba on your doorstep. It's going to jeopardize your rule. And through that, he's able to convince, on the one hand, the Tunku to accept Singapore, to convince the British to create Malaysia, and they sweeten the pot by including North Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak, which has valuable natural reserves, and also able to sell this plan to the people of Singapore because we see ourselves as Malayan and we desire reunification. And he argues that, look, if you want independence, the only way we're going to get it is through this form of reunification, because the Tunku will never agree to any other form. The British will never agree to any other form. The problem is that in order to get the Tunku to agree, they create a structure where Singapore is very much quarantined within Malaysia, where Singaporeans have fewer political rights than the rest of Malaysia, where we're underrepresented in the federal parliament. So the metaphor that I like to use to explain this is that, imagine you're told, hey, you can come back into the family home. You can have your own bedroom. But the condition is you can't leave your bedroom, right? And without the rest of us agreeing. In your bedroom, you're going to have more rights than the rest of everyone. You can even open a shop in your bedroom window and sell things to people in the street. But the moment you leave your bedroom, you're treated as 2/3 of a citizen. Your vote in this household is 2/3 of the rest of us. You're treated as a foreigner in the rest of the household, right? So if you were if it was you in your bedroom, and you're okay in your bedroom for a while, but ultimately, how are you going to build a family unit if you're forever treated with suspicion and told, oh, you can only stay in your bedroom, and look, we gave you extra privileges in your bedroom, just stay in there, right? It's not going to work in long term. But that's what Lee sold. That's what the opposition in Singapore, who his former allies in the PAP, who by that point in time had split off to form a rival party, they predicted it was never going to work. But he managed to sell this to the people of Singapore by saying, look, if we don't have reunification now in this way, we're never going to get it. And he held a very sketchy referendum where people did not have the choice to vote no, right? The referendum for merger had 3 options for yes. His option was by far the best, and then he gave 2 extremely inferior versions of yes. So of course people voted for his option, and on that basis he declared victory, took Singapore into Malaysia, and the moment that the ink was dry and his opponents were then detained by the federal government, he turned around and he said, this whole arrangement is unfair to the people of Singapore, and how can anyone permit this? We have fewer rights, and this is, unjust, and promptly tries to overturn the whole thing. And of course, the Tunku and the politicians in Kuala Lumpur are like, what the hell? You are the one who negotiated this whole arrangement, right? And so, of course, they come to loggerheads. And I can go into a lot more detail about this if you like, but basically that's why Singapore then splits off from Malaysia after 2 years, because it's either Lee plays brinkmanship, right? It's either he puts the Tunku in a position where Tunku has to choose between his democratic and liberal instincts versus taking care of his own political base. And to his Lee's surprise, his gamble fails, and the Tunku chooses his political base, his Malay voters, over protecting justice and equality for the country as a whole. And in some ways, he shouldn't have been surprised, because the Tunku is an aristocrat, right? He sees his role very much as taking care of his people.
That was obviously an immensely skillful bit of political manipulation by Lee to kind of play off different constituencies within Singapore and Malaya against each other.
Yes.
Yeah, I love the story of the referendum that you just told as well, because it bears some fairly obvious parallels to the Brexit referendum in the aftermath as well, about negotiating a crap outcome for yourself and then complaining about it forever after. If we just talk about Singapore's development thereafter, once this issue of kind of the merger is put to bed, Singapore's economy developed incredibly quickly over the time that Lee was in power. It's become an immensely successful economic story. The way I've read about it is that he, as a leader and as a kind of economic manager, he always favoured longer term planning over short term economic populism. And the economy and the model that he developed focused very much on economic growth rather than labour rights, creating a welfare state. Is that correct?
I think you need to nuance that a lot.
Go on. Okay.
So first things first, the architect of Singapore's economic growth was a man named Goh Keng Swee, the finance minister, not Lee Kuan Yew. Right? Lee was the master of political power and amassing the power that Goh then used to develop Singapore's economy. So we have to give Goh Keng Swee more credit for Singapore's economic development. Now, we also have to remember that Singapore inherited a huge amount of infrastructure from the British. The port was sold to the Singapore government for $1, I think, right? And we have a natural resource which can never be taken away, which is geography. Singapore, even after independence, still, to this day, remains at an ideal place for shipping. Something like, half or 2/3 of the world's shipping goes past Singapore, right? Goes through the Malacca Straits. There is no equivalent of the Suez Canal to bypass us, although the Malaysians keep talking about something at the Kra Isthmus, right? The Malaysians and Thais would like to build a canal, but no. To this date, we still have a natural geographic advantage. Another thing was political, and here is where you can credit Lee. I think in that when Singapore became independent, the world, the third world, the former colonial world, right? The third world in the sense of the Cold War, First World, Second World, our political units, the non-aligned world, was very suspicious of foreign capital. You have Kwame Nkrumah's, neocolonialism, right? The idea that Western European former colonial countries would continue to exercise influence in your economies through capital. And this was a phenomenon that was already well known and understood at the time. So what you see is a lot of places where colonial investment used to go are now rejecting colonial investment and trying to build up a strong class of local capitalists who can then fund development. In Singapore, on the other hand, Lee understands that Singapore is highly dependent on foreign capital and has an advantage at this point where if we continue to welcome foreign investment at a time where other colonial countries are rejecting it, then we actually will benefit immensely. And at the same time, he has no desire, actually on the contrary, he does not want to build up a local capitalist class because the historic opposition to the People's Action Party comes from the Chinese speaking of Singapore, and the local capitalist class is overwhelmingly Chinese capitalists. So he actually wants to tame and discipline them and reduce their influence on Singapore society, Singapore's economy. So he welcomes foreign capital at the exact moment where A, other former colonial countries are rejecting it, but B, you have excess capital in the West which needs investment, where capitalist profitability in the US and in Europe was actually declining, and they wanted to go abroad and invest it, right? They had come out of the post-war period, and this was the 60s, right? And there was a boom, and they wanted, the problem was, right, because of the socialist left-wing movements, labor rights, labor gaining a stronger hand electorally, the strength of trade unions, capitalist profitability was low in Europe and in the US. So they want to take the capital abroad, and Singapore was a welcome place for that, right? We welcomed it very much. So that is what you can congratulate Lee and Goh Keng Swee for. And that is why it led to very rapid gains in the 60s and 70s, to the point where by the late 70s we have full employment, we have rapidly rising living standards, where we're talking about ourselves as approaching the first world, right? And that, of course, is coupled with complete political control internally, because after Malaysia, the political opposition is rounded up and arrested. And by 1968, the PAP has a complete monopoly of parliament. Every single seat is held by them. So between 68 and 81, they hold every single seat in parliament, and there's money eagerly sloshing in looking for profits. And we have a rapidly growing population which is very eager for employment and is low cost work, but well educated. And all of that combines to create this capitalist playground where we're able to take in all these profits and develop the country rapidly. And then all of that quickly falls apart in the 80s. And once Singapore reaches a point, and again, right, Lee and Goh Keng Swee were very far-sighted. They realized that we have reached full employment and high living standards, and costs are rising. Employment costs are rising. We cannot continue to be this country which gives high returns on capital investment, because high costs, high living standards, people have become used to a lot more. So they see the future as being one where you need to generate ideas, where, in some ways they foresee this modern economy where generating intellectual property, right, and owning the intellectual property and investing it elsewhere for returns is the future. And they want Singapore to get there. The problem is they try to unilaterally re-legislate Singapore's position in the global economy. So they say, they impose wage rises on the whole country. They try and impose technological innovation. They try and create the environment for creating a high-tech economy, right? The problem is they do this without releasing, in fact, the opposite. In order to do this, they tighten political control significantly and clamp down on dissidents. But the thing is, innovation requires, an environment where people can break rules, right? That's why innovation thrives in California and not in Beijing, right? You look at these big tech firms, and a lot of profitability today comes from actually breaking the law to begin with. Look at Uber around the world. Look at what Elon Musk does with Tesla, right? He makes a lot of money. But step one is like identify regulations that, are inefficient and break them, right? So you can't do that in Singapore, okay? But that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is global capital looks at Singapore and looks at what the government is trying to do with technology transfers, right? Insisting on technology transfers, raising the cost of employment of workers, and says, no thanks. And they just leave. And within 1 year, foreign direct investment plummets by 1/3. Singapore goes into a massive recession, right? And it's at this same point in time where the government has shifted from a socialist perspective to, as a new generation comes in, they're introducing a neoliberal perspective, right? Housing subsidies are slashed. The cost of healthcare, right? Healthcare was fundamentally free until about 1980-81. Then neoliberal reforms were introduced. So on the one hand, you have increasing costs for all these things, and on the other hand, massive recession and a withdrawal of foreign direct investment. You have this massive crash in Singapore, and that's where we start electing opposition politicians again. 1981, J.B. Jeyaretnam, 1984, Chiam See Tong. And the PHP's response is two things. One is they end free and fair elections, right? Up to that point in time, their main way of controlling parliament was to sue or intimidate or arrest opposition politicians, but the elections themselves are still reasonably free. But there's a raft of changes in the 80s which make our elections fundamentally unfair, unfree, and while the vote itself remains free, I mean, no one's going to tell you exactly how to vote. The whole structure of the elections are designed to maximize positive outcomes for the PAP, in particular through the threat of punishment. If your constituency votes in an opposition, you're severely punished after that. But this whole broad idea that he has is Singapore's population, I think fundamentally he sees Singapore as letting him down, right? He wanted to build an ideal society and it failed, and it's everyone's fault except his. So he introduces all these new ideas, eugenics, right? The graduate mother scheme, where he tries to get educated women he tries to get women and men with superior genes to reproduce more. But how do you measure superior genes? And his idea is, if you're rich or you're well educated, right? He also introduces the idea of sterilization for people with poorer genes, which means overwhelmingly poor women of color, women who are less educated, right, are bribed or coerced into sterilizing themselves. He introduces the form of very egalitarian, multilingual educational system is collapsed into a single stream of English and then tiered so that the most highly talented youngsters are identified at a very young age and lots of resources thrown at them, right, to maximize the efficiency of the education system. But of course, it becomes self-fulfilling, because if you're going to take youngsters from a young age and give them all the best resources, they're obviously going to do the best, right? But everything then becomes very much about efficiency and maximizing outcomes. And this is where Singapore is today, where we're obsessed, right? We have this whole neoliberal mindset. So we have socialist tools for transforming the country, where the government has the ability to go very intimately into your life and affect, who you marry, how many children you have, where you live, right? All these things that are really none of the government's business, the government can affect. And it can outright tell you which race you are.
I want to get to the issue of democracy and freedom in the Singapore that Lee created, PJ. Just very simply, in your mind, is Singapore a democracy? And what were Lee's views on democracy?
The problem with Lee's views on democracy, right, is that they changed drastically over time. When he was in opposition, he was very much in favor of it. The moment he got into power, he rapidly grew cold on democracy and human rights. And the longer he stayed in power, the more he cracked down, and the more he made mistakes in particular, the more he saw people expressing their views as dangerous. You know, he very much identified his vision of society as being Singapore's vision, and his rule, his governance being what was best for Singapore. And naturally, therefore, if you disagree with that, you must be a dissident, dangerous, you're a threat to the nation, and must be shut down. So by the end of his time in power, he was openly talking about things like, maybe older people should have more votes. Maybe people with families should have more votes. Maybe younger people who, don't understand, are less mature, should have fewer votes, right? He had already, as I mentioned, in the late 80s, rigged the electoral system to maximize outcomes for the PAP, but he was actually openly, publicly musing about even more extreme steps to undermine democracy. And ultimately, Lee Kuan Yew will say and do and believe in anything that perpetuates his vision, his rule, his governance. And actually, that's one reason why things have been, it's so dangerous, because people often quote the statesman Lee, the Lee later in life, who felt it very necessary to justify all the evil things that he had done as part of the greater good, right? And the problem is, many of the things he did were merely out of expedience, out of political necessity, merely, created on the fly to justify what he was doing. The rationales he was giving was to justify his policies rather than genuine ideology or a belief, ideals, any sort of core values. But we have come to take many of his pronouncements, especially the PAP government today, have come to take many of his pronouncements as gospel. And more dangerously, authoritarians around the world have come to use his justifications for authoritarianism as gospel, when there's evidence that he didn't even believe them himself. He just said them because it was what was necessary for him to justify whatever he was doing at the time. So Lee is very much a person who believes in himself, not in the people. I would put it that way.
When you're thinking about democracy in kind of abstract terms, obviously you have the idea of democracy in the specific sense of voting for a government in free and fair elections. And you've mentioned that there are issues with that when it comes to Singapore and to Lee specifically. It's also worth noting, obviously, that the PAP, I don't think, have ever lost an election. But outside of that,
I should also point out they've never won a free and fair election. That's also true. The PAP have never won a free and fair election.
I mean, but outside of voting, you have the much more general tranche of kind of civil liberties and personal freedoms. I understand that the system has obviously worked quite well according to its own logic. Singapore's an extremely successful country. It's politically stable, although obviously that's kind of a loaded term. But it does lack political and personal freedoms that are available to other people in the world. I think it only legalized kind of online activism in 2010. The press is very tightly regulated by the government. Even activity between same-sex individuals, not same-sex marriage or same-sex adoption, but just same-sex activity between men is illegal. I know that those are obviously quite diverse examples of lack of political freedoms. But on the status of homosexuals specifically, I fail to see how the extension of rights to a very small number of people would throw the internal stability of Singapore into disarray. I mean, do you as a Singaporean view those lack of personal freedoms as kind of a necessary evil? Do you view it in a positive light, or do you think that your country is worsened for these things?
Oh, very much worse. Okay, here's several things, right? The first is that the idea of Singapore as a success story is a myth. 1/3 of the country live in poverty, right? You never see that number touted. Everyone talks about Singapore as a success story. And the thing is, on an absolute level, our income is very high. The problem is costs in Singapore are ridiculously high, right? We are always among the top 1-2 most expensive places in the world to live, and we don't have a hinterland or rural area you can retreat to. So Singapore is ridiculously expensive. So on an absolute level, the numbers are high, but on a relative level, right, purchasing power, Singaporeans are actually not very well off, and independent studies have shown that 1/3 of Singaporeans are unable to make enough money to service the massive debt that the government loads on them, and in particular in the form of housing, healthcare, and cars. Right, Singapore is the most expensive place in the world to own a car because the government levies 200-250% tax on car ownership on top of a lot of other taxes, for example. And the government insists that we have to basically pay our own way on healthcare. It doesn't spend anything on I forget the term, on a cash flow basis. The government doesn't spend anything on healthcare, right? It's entirely paid for by what we're paying for healthcare, basically. So costs are very, very high. Singaporeans live in poverty, and it's a very, very expensive, stressful place to live. So that's one thing. Another thing, though, is your discussion of civil liberties, right? And here is where you see the continued legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, because the only thing that the People's Action Party have got going for them to win elections is his legacy. Any attempt by the current Prime Minister, the campaign on his legacy, right, Lee Hsien Loong, Lee Kuan Yew's son, right, has been in power since 2006 and has achieved nothing except a worsening of our economy and skyrocketing of inequality. Life has gotten demonstrably, measurably worse under his government. So the only way he can keep justifying power is Lee Kuan Yew, is his father. And that's why you see every election, they talk about Lee Kuan Yew, right? Every time they have a big policy, they talk about Lee Kuan Yew, And the problem is that means you cannot change things from how Lee Kuan Yew left them. The moment you depart in a fundamental way from what Lee Kuan Yew did, you're rejecting your own legacy. And if you reject your own legacy, you're undermining your own argument for winning elections. So they can tweak at the margins, but they're terrified of fundamental change in Singapore in any way that departs from the Singapore that Lee Kuan Yew left behind in 1990. And that's why it's such a huge disaster for Singapore, because we have a government that's absolutely paralyzed at the moment, which is unable to move forward, unable to decide what kind of vision. It has no vision for the future. It's unable to pick a successor to Lee Hsien Loong. It is very much trapped in the past and just terrified of doing anything apart from continuing to keep the machine ticking over. See, so we talk about civil liberties is actually symptomatic of a broader problem of Lee Kuan Yew himself and his inability to actually create a proper succession or to move on from the scene. At the very beginning, you talked about his longevity. Arguably, he's still there. They can't get rid of him. They can't get rid of his ideology. He's Bangkok's ghost at the feast, right? And until Singapore can get rid of him and move on, we're going to slowly slip backwards. We're held in stasis, right? And things are just going to get worse.
I mean, he sounds like an immense control freak. And somebody who really couldn't stand any way of what he believed should happen.
Absolutely.
He stepped down formally as Prime Minister, I think, in 1990, but he didn't die. He had a very long retirement. He didn't die until 2015.
Yeah.
did he attempt to, and I think I know the answer to this, did he attempt to act as a kind of backseat driver afterwards?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He stayed in the cabinet as senior minister, right? And then after his successor stepped down, his successor, Goh Chok Tong, became senior minister, and then they invented this whole new term for Lee Kuan Yew's position called minister mentor. And so he stayed in the cabinet, breathing over, down the necks and looking over the shoulder of of Goh Chok Tong and of Lee Hsien Loong, all the way until we suffered, or rather the PAP suffered a massive reverse in the 2013 elections, and then he finally stepped down. 2011 elections. And then he finally stepped down. Yeah, but he continued to openly meddle, and he continued to, for example, intervene in all sorts of things, labor disputes, right? He continued to be sent abroad as this senior statesman figure to manage our relationship, in particular with China, right? To the detriment, because today we don't have anyone else who is an experienced diplomat to work with China, and we keep coming up short on the international arena because for so many years we leaned on, let's just send Lee Kuan Yew to deal with it, right? So there are, very concrete issues about a lack of capacity, a lack of training up of a new generation, because Lee Kuan Yew continued to guide and lead and meddle in so many things even after he stepped down as Prime Minister.
So how does Singapore get away from this just bizarre cryogenic state then? I mean,
there really is only one thing. We have to vote the PAP out. As long as the PAP is in power, right? Yeah. They are relying on his legacy, and in particular, Lee Hsien Loong. Lee Hsien Loong's entire rationale for being in office is because he's Lee Kuan Yew's son. He has no achievements of his own. There's no justification for having Lee Hsien Loong in power. He's done nothing of his own bat, on his own steam in Singapore. Everything comes from the fact that Lee Kuan Yew put him there and propped him up, and created all sorts of justifications, awarded him all sorts of scholarships, right, to make him look good, sent him on all these training programs to Harvard and so on, right, all to make him look good and justify his eventual accession to power. Lee Hsien Loong has no other justification, and, that's part of the problem. So Lee Hsien Loong can't pick a successor at the moment. His chosen successor they dropped out after all sorts of issues, and there's no clear successor to him. So you have this man who turns 70 soon, and he's exhausted, and the PAP is in stasis. And it's a real tragedy because they had a fantastic candidate. The former finance minister, an Indian by the name of Tharman Shanmugaratnam, is widely respected and loved in Singapore. And if the PAP had made him the deputy prime minister and the successor to Lee Hsien Loong, the PAP would have secured, its rule for another generation, right? But they couldn't even, come and pick the most obvious best candidate. Why? Because he is a very significant departure from Lee Kuan Yew, right? And the Lee family still has so much investment in the current status quo. Until recently, Ho Ching, Lee Hsien Loong's wife, was the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so between her and the Prime Minister, they ruled Singapore very much with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. And to appoint an outsider like Tharman to become the next Prime Minister was too much of a departure from the status quo and potential undermining of the power of the Lee family. So, it's quite amazing, but they had the perfect candidate right there. Globally respected, locally respected, loved, admired, wins by the biggest share at every election. And they couldn't make him prime minister because he is, too much of an outsider to the Lee family. And the justification was, it's because Singaporeans are not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister, which is racist. And it's also bullshit because our very first chief minister was a Jew. So this was in 1955, right? We were ready back then. I don't know why we're not ready now.
One of the tropes of the conversation that we've had today has been that Lee constantly wanted to kind of do what the British were doing, but have himself in charge of it. And I think in the end, the kind of stasis and the lack of any sort of political innovation or new ideas or even just new people, ironically, is actually something, it's a conversation that we in Britain have all the time, because we still, like Singapore, draw our leaders from a very narrow base of people. The people that are running the country now, not literally, of course, but the people that are running the country now are the same crop of people that were running the country nearly 100 years ago when we were fighting the Second World War. Boris Johnson,
Yeah.
David Cameron, George Osborne.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the ultimate irony, is that he's ended up, in his constant attempts to copy the British, has copied us in arguably our worst internal trait, which is our class stasis.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah.
So how optimistic are you about the demise of the PAP then, just as a final question? Because of this tight control of the media and the political system, do you think there's any hope for their demise?
Well, there's always hope. I think you're seeing a lot of the difficulties in the PAP break out into the public in recent years, including their inability to pick a successor to Lee Hsien Loong. They're so rudderless at the moment without a clear political vision for the future, right? And that is really translating into a lot of problems policy-wise, because they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing, and they don't know where they want to go. And this means that there's a lot of huge frustration and anger on the ground. But in particular, the PAP has always prided itself on very sort of technocratic, competent administration. And COVID, the whole pandemic, has really exposed how badly they are run, and how there are certain very deep-set assumptions within the party and within the government about the country, which no longer reflect the country as a whole. But I think what most people are seeing is incompetence, and it's very shocking to most people that how badly the PAP have handled the pandemic. And I think that is going to be the thing that exposes and leads to their demise. Unfortunately, because of unfree and unfair elections, their tight control of the media and so on, it may be that it's most likely that we will need some serious disaster to come along before they will actually lose power, right? Because of the way we have the first past the post system, which I don't need to explain to you, is very problematic. The PAP could win as little as 30-something% of the vote and still be returned to power. And the way that they manipulate elections, very problematic. The gerrymandering, if they lose a seat, they basically redraw all the boundaries the next election to ensure that pro-PAP votes are brought in. So it's going to actually require, and this is where I worry for Singapore, probably something so bad that even the loyalists start voting against the PAP. And Singapore being a very small country and constantly buffeted by, all these very difficult forces, economic, social, cultural, political. If something is that bad, right? What does it mean for the country as a whole? Are we even going to be
exactly
viable? How bad does the country have to be before we are willing to elect another government? The good news is the opposition does look very competent. And they have had their own crises, but they've handled them pretty well. And I think it's given people a lot of hope and faith that even if the PAP fails, that there are people, good people, reasonably competent people out there who can take over. So I do have some hope. I do have a lot of hope in my countrymen, and I think that, ultimately we will find our way through this. But I do worry about what it's going to take in order for us to finally leave Lee Kuan Yew behind.
Well, thank you very much, PJ. You've challenged a lot of my assumptions about Singapore as a place, which has really interested me, actually, because the picture that you've painted is not the picture of the country that I had in my head. I say that as a person who's never been there and as somebody who doesn't know a great deal about the politics of the country. PJ, where can people find your work?
Well, they should go to my website, my company's website. I run a media company now called New Narrative, Newnaratif. So it's newnarrative.com. And I publish all my work there in the form of articles and videos and podcasts. And we also cover all of Southeast Asia. We're an investigative journalism outfit that also does research and has a lot of events. So if people would like to learn more about Singapore or about Southeast Asia as a whole, please do visit us, newnarrative.com. We're entirely reliant on membership subscriptions. We carry no advertising. So if you'd like to support the work that I do or the work that we do, trying to bring the truth, trying to fight for media freedom in Southeast Asia, go to newnarrative.com/join to join as a member, or newnarrative.com/donate to donate to our cause. Thank you.
Great, PJ. Thank you very much. I've been on New Narrative a couple of times since we got into contact, and it's a fantastic project you have. So please, everyone, do go and have a look at that. PJ, it's been great talking to you, and I hope you have a lovely Christmas, okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity to come on your show, and Merry Christmas to you too.
It's a pleasure. Thanks. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.